Mel Weitzman gave a answer once, or he answered the question of why do you practice this way. He said it's similar as a gardener. He talked about his experience as a gardener, and he said, and it's similar to spiritual practice is similar to working on the soil, to getting a rich, loamy soil, a healthy soil. Um, It's a really good metaphor, I think, as someone who's not a good gardener. And I know um, in this group there are many really good gardeners. I know from firsthand experience of witnessing. Um, for the less adept among us in the gardening arts, we want to plant something and then we just plant it, and it either doesn't do well in the soil because we haven't tended to it, or we try all these quick fixes just to get it to work. So there's something really, so I can only take the metaphor so far because of my lack of experience, but there's something about working the soil that does seem similar to spiritual practice, because it's something that's not readily apparent. And the impulse often with spiritual practice is, we want something that'll show right away. I mean, maybe that's just in life. We want things that'll show right away. Um, and there's something very devotional about working slowly, really over the years, to get a good soil. And if we think of ourselves, our beings, as soil, as earth, I think it's a lovely, lovely way of thinking about it, the way Mel names it. Um, I think every time we sit, our soil gets, a little richer, a little darker, right? A little healthier. Um, and slowly there are so many more things that can grow in it. There's so much more growth that it will support. There's so much more capacity in terms of, let's say, working on the midot. I wanted to talk about savlanut, patience, this morning, as that's the midah that I'm working with this week, and I'll come back to that. But to talk about savlanut, if you just take a midah and plant it immediately in soil that hasn't been tended to, it's we're going to be strained in our practice of it. We won't really have the breadth and the depth to practice it. It will be performative to some degree. Like, well, maybe we'll be able to rise to the occasion and grit out some actions that could be described as exercising patience. But it's going to strain us. And so I love the image of planting the midah in like well cared for soil, you know. Um, and of course, this is where, you know, if we are still in the dichotomy of self-care and other care, you see that the necessity of what we would call self-care in order for the midah to be planted and to flourish, and that we might practice it with breadth and depth. We need to take care of our own soil. And in a way, when we practice the midah, then from that place, we're contributing to someone else's soil, right? It's like that interaction also supports the spiritual practice of those who we're coming in contact with. I thought of it, this is not necessarily around like good soil in our raised beds. I mean, I'm thinking of it now, even it feels like a leap of faith in that we're putting all these leaves and all of these, like, to let the soil rest and be sort of protected and have, the winter rituals around that. But also just the planting of bulbs also feels like a lovely metaphor in terms of spiritual practice and Mussar practice. I'd like to put the daffodil in, or the garlic, or whatever it is, and to know we won't see it again for a long time, and we'll probably forget about it. Um, Maybe we'll never see it. Maybe someone else will enjoy it. But again, it's this sort of steady faith that allows us to do those kind of gestures of planting what we won't see, of working the soil. Um, so I've been thinking about this with Savlanut, with patients, and in the wake of the election, and just in general. And I think patience is a really hard one. Although I'm appreciative about how CCM teaches about Savlanut. Um, some of you will remember there's this idea of wasted grief. For the things that we can't control, our inability to accept the situation leads to wasted grief. And when we're really in a place of Savlanut, of patience, we're not suffering from wasted grief. We might have very legitimate, sort of immediate grief in a different respect, but I've always been intrigued by that concept of wasted grief. And there's the tendency just to, in the wake of the election, although it's not specific to that, right? We know this feeling in general of feeling like, well, we can't be patient, right? We have to mobilize, we have to get ready, we have to work even harder. And so I've been just thinking about, so what is Savlanut here? What is wasted grief? When we have those feelings. So first of all, I think it's important to say that every midah is sort of the answer, and it's up to us to figure out the question. It's up to us to figure out how this midah could work for each of us at this time that each of us are in. How do we really take on the responsibility of making it work so the midah aids us in actively being more awake to the needs of others? So I think paradoxically, when there's real acceptance of any situation, even if it's an unwanted situation, there's a kind of liberation in that. And I think the paradoxical piece is, in the presence of that acceptance, we see more clearly what it is that we're called to do, in terms of our actions that then will come forth, in the next day, the next week, the next month. And I think that's the paradox, that we really do have to, what does it mean to practice radical acceptance of moments that we really don't want to accept? And so for me, that's a lot of the work in trying to figure out how patience manifests right now, or how it could manifest, or what it would look like to practice patience. And I think one way of doing this is just working the soil, is returning to the practice, not knowing exactly what we'll plant when we next plant, but knowing that we're going to need the good soil in order to do the work that we're called to do. I think Savlanut also, in the times where we're mystified by the world of ideas and politics, like for me, Savlanut also reminds me to return time and again to every interpersonal encounter that I have, to taking the time literally or figuratively to bow to someone, to sort of honor each encounter, right? It's like the quote from Bio Akumalafe that we offered a few weeks ago: times are urgent, we must slow down. So Savla Newt somehow helps me to just, okay, sit. It's Wednesday morning. We're sitting and to have my hands in the earth in that respect, metaphorically. And then just with each encounter, to notice it, to not become so lost in our wasted grief. I think this is a great description of wasted grief. We get so lost in it that when we look up, dozens of people have passed us that we haven't even noticed, or someone from the next room is calling us and we gave some half awake response. That's because we're lost in wasted grief. And the last thing I'll say is I think wasted grief, this concept helps remind us of the grief that's not wasted. So when we say, like, God, all of the things that I'm suffering about, that I don't maybe need to be suffering about in exactly this way, and also that are taking me away from my daily obligations and awareness and zihirut, wakefulness. Um, Not only is it taking me away from that, but then sometimes it can almost remind me that the wasted grief often is a shield, a protector around the necessary grief. Often I'll feel like, oh, when I stop with the wasted grief, I'll see that wasted grief was sort of protecting me from the necessary grief, like the real grief of any given moment. So it's funny in that respect too. It can help patience can help us see where the real grief is, and to let that through. We start distinguishing. Not all grief is created equal. So I invite you to wherever you are sitting, to bring yourself into a position of, if you're not already there, of comfort, of kind of an open but rooted stance, to let your breath find you this morning, to let it find you, to let your body find you, to not hide or duck from any particular thoughts or feelings, but just to watch them as you would a cloud in the sky. If it's a dark storm cloud, it will pass at some point. If it's a beautiful cloud, it will also pass at some point. And you can even think of yourself as the sky. And maybe that thought, that particular cloud that's floating across, maybe it's not who I am in some inherent way. Maybe it's that this is just what it is to be the sky as clouds pass through it. So maybe we don't need to identify with that particular cloud, or any clouds for that matter. It's just part of being the sky. So we'll sit for about 15 minutes. Hareini mekabel elai et mitzvat haborei be'ahavta l'reaha kamocha v'zchut ze eftach pi. May we be ready to take upon ourselves the mitzvah of loving our fellow human being as ourselves, and by this merit, may we open our mouths. By this merit, may we move into our days. Amen.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.